Hello and welcome back to Business Matters at the Hindu with me, K. Bharat Kumar. Earlier this month, UN Chief Mr. Antonio Guterres said that the GDP is not the most accurate way to measure a nation's progress and wealth. It's a bit of a shocker, right? I mean, there have been whispers around, different people saying GDP measures only economic progress. There are other aspects to development that we must measure. But coming from the UN Chief, the Secretary-General, no less, seems a bit of a shock. Why did he say this? What is the context? In a statement to mark World Environment Day earlier this month, he made two notable suggestions. One, he said, G20 countries must dismantle their coal-powered infrastructure. Second, he added that to rescue the global environment and humanity's future, we must transform the accounting systems that reward pollution and waste. He said we must place true value on the environment and go beyond gross domestic product as a measure of human progress and well-being. Let us not forget that when we destroy a forest, we are creating GDP. When we overfish, we are creating GDP. GDP is not the way to measure richness in the present situation in the world. Is this approach at all feasible? What do economists think of this? We spoke to a couple of them. Dr. Biswajit Dhar, a former professor of economics at the JNU and a former member of the National Biodiversity Authority, says that Mr. Guterres has slavishly reproduced the advanced country narrative, which essentially shifts the burden of rectifying environmental degradation onto developing nations, which he says is unfair, at least on three counts. First off, he says that developing nations now have to bear the responsibility for fixing a problem that they have not caused. He says this because advanced nations have abandoned a couple of principles. First is the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. And the second is the principle of polluter pays. The principle of polluter pays actually demands an honest admission on the part of developed countries in the role that they played in occupying the carbon space during the Industrial Revolution, which has now left developing nations such little space to pursue their developmental aspirations. Importantly, Agenda 21 argued on the imperative of the global north supporting the south, not just by providing adequate financial resources for the protection and preservation of environment, but also by providing access to environment-friendly technologies which developing countries could obtain at arm's length. While there have been discussions on the massive inadequacy of climate finance, very little attention has been paid to the fact that climate-friendly technologies are zealously protected by advanced countries using IPR or intellectual property rights. Unfortunately, access to such technology is being made even more difficult through the consistent push for ratcheting up standards of protecting IPRs. Finally, Professor Dhar says that advanced nations and their corporations have been engaged in the destruction of carbon sinks through the mindless exploitation of biodiversity. So, the only way to solve the problem that Secretary-General Guterres has spoken of is to make sure that members of the United Nations are all made aware of the commitments that they've made to save the planet more than 3 decades ago, says Professor Dhar. Professor Lekha Chakraborty of the NIPFP agrees that the beyond GDP paradigm should be the global goal. Economic growth per se cannot translate into human development. Sustainable development must clearly be given priority in policy. But she's also quick to point out that in this transition, financing is crucial. She says that the bullying of the global south by the global north is intensifying and that this approach is myopic because the energy intensity of the Western world is disproportionately higher than in developing economies. She says the methodology proposed by economists Amartya Sen and Mahbub ul Haq in quantifying human development along with the UN's indices that measure inequalities such as the Gender Development Index and the Gender Inequality Index are sound alternatives to pure GDP metrics. Soon after Mr. Guterres' speech earlier this month, the Observer Research Foundation put out a policy framework that suggested ways to go beyond just measuring GDP. The paper says that it is wrongful to engage in activities that leads to the destruction of the natural world around us or to the disintegration of our communities. It put out a dashboard that has 4 components. The first is solidarity that helps measure social cohesion and embeddedness. This, the paper says, covers the needs of humans as social creatures living in communities with a sense of belonging. Next comes agency, or measuring empowerment. It covers an individual's need to shape their life through their own efforts, both personally and collectively. It includes mastery of the environment, personal growth, and attainment of collective and personal goals. Third comes gain. This, of course, covers GDP and profit. This variable is central in the economist's toolkit. Finally, the dashboard talks about environmental sustainability. E measures the impact of human actions on the natural world. It includes not only the consumption of what economists call environmental services, but also the need to support the flourishing of the natural world. However, Professor Dhar is skeptical, and he says that the ideas embedded in the SAGE model are almost impossible to achieve. He says it's simply not feasible in an economic model that has given owners of capital the freedom to exploit all resources, but especially environment and labor resources, just to maximize their profits. He says this model has set in motion the process of a race to the bottom, which is also unfortunately backed by governments. He, however, acknowledges that several suggestions have come pouring in over time that suggest ways to look beyond just GDP as a metric for wealth and progress. He says the first step in this direction should be to adopt a green GDP, or green national accounting standards. He says a more comprehensive approach in this regard would be to adopt the SEA, or the System of Integrated Environment and Economic Accounting, a hybrid accounting system that integrates environmental stresses and economic activities. In 2021, the United Nations Statistical Commission had adopted the SEA, or Environmental Accounting. This is a framework for organizing data about habitats and landscapes, measuring ecosystem services, tracking change in ecosystem assets, and linking all of this information to economic and other human activity. Before we wind down this episode, I want to ask you, what do you think about GDP as a metric? Have you come across any other system, an accounting system that does away with GDP or wants to supplement the GDP that you think is ideal? Write to us in the comments below. This is a very interesting space to watch out for. And if you're watching this on YouTube, do not forget to like, share, or subscribe before you go away. Until we meet again, have a lovely week ahead.